Okay, in this example that I'm about to show you, look at the depth of how the language in the Quran is related to the story that's going on in the context. Simply, I'm comparing two verses. It's the story of when Moses took the children of Israel and was running away from the Pharaoh and his army. So, as they were running away, Pharaoh was chasing them. So, in one of the verses, which is chapter number 10, verse number 90, it says, "We brought the children of Israel across the sea. Then Pharaoh," notice this, Pharaoh and his soldiers. It's very important to notice this and his soldiers pursued them. They were pursuing them. So it's important that this verse in Surah Yunus, chapter 10, verse 90 says, "Pharaoh and his soldiers pursued them unjustly and oppressively." However, the same story this is chapter number 10, way ahead in the Quran, chapter number 20, right? 10 plus chapters. Chapter number 20, verse 78 says, "Then Pharaoh pursued them with his soldiers." So I'm about to show you something very beautiful. Just focus here. Pharaoh pursued them with his soldiers, right? In chapter number 20 it says. Now, what you have to notice is, in language, it's important to know that in chapter number 10, where it says, "Pharaoh and his soldiers pursued them," it means both Pharaoh and his soldiers were pursuing them. It was Pharaoh, he was there, and his soldiers. But when you say in language, the Pharaoh pursued them with his soldiers, this has the connotation that he, with his soldiers, meaning with the help of his soldiers, meaning maybe Pharaoh was behind them, the soldiers were ahead, or the Pharaoh simply sent his soldiers. It can have the connotation that he pursued them with the help of his soldiers. Not necessarily the Pharaoh was there, right? He could be, he could not be, right? In Arabic, it's Fir'auna bi junudihi, with the help of his soldiers. But in chapter 10, it's Fir'auna wa junuduhu, and wa means and, right? So why would God in one verse in chapter number 10 say Pharaoh was chased him and his soldiers chased him, both of them? In one verse he would only say he chased him with his soldiers. We know both of them were there because the other verse tells us, but why just include Pharaoh and soldiers, just lump sum, put them together in this verse with his soldiers? But in this specific verse in chapter number 10, put Pharaoh, like put him in the limelight, separate him from his army. Why? Specifically mention Pharaoh as chasing them. Now look at the context. This verse, chapter 10, where Pharaoh is singled out, it says Pharaoh and his soldiers pursued them. The next verses mention the punishment that came upon Pharaoh himself. Look at this. Pharaoh and his soldiers pursued them unjustly and oppressively, but as Pharaoh was drowning. Now it's the punishment upon Pharaoh alone, on himself. But as Pharaoh was drowning, he cried out, "I believe that there is no God except that in whom the children of Israel believed in, and I am now one of those who submit." He was told, "Now you believe, but you always disobeyed and were one of the corruptors. Today we will preserve your corpse," Pharaoh's own corpse, "so that you may become an example for those who come after you. Surely people are." Subhanallah. Here, when the punishment was specifically discussed in the later verse about Pharaoh himself, he was singular. It was much linguistically accurate to single out Pharaoh when talking about Pharaoh and his soldiers pursuing. Subhanallah. But in Surah Taha, when the Pharaoh is mentioned along with his soldiers, like Pharaoh pursued him with his soldiers, he and his army were one and the same thing. They were just going together. By the way, the with had also the connotation that the Pharaoh sent his army ahead, but we know from the other verse, Pharaoh also came. So when God just puts them together, both of them, look at the punishment that happened. But how overwhelming were the waters that submerged them. The punishment came upon all of them, and so Pharaoh led his people astray and did not guide them. It's talking about the entire army being drowned. It's not the punishment is not upon Pharaoh. Subhanallah. You see where the punishment is upon Pharaoh himself. He's singled out in the usage of language and his words. But where the punishment occurs on the entire army, we submerge them. فَغَشِيَهُمْ مِنَ الْيَمِّ مَا غَشِيَهُمْ. And so the waters, overwhelming were the waters that submerged them. The entire army went down. Allah mentions both of them because subhanallah, how minute is the use and how subtle is the use of language. So perfect that the context of the story is according to the use of the language is according to the context of the story. Subhanallah, how in depth, in detail, is the perfect use of the language of the Qur'an. And subhanallah, this is one of the beauties of the Qur'an, that the high quality language is being used to fit the words and their usages with the context, perfect context of the story. So may God give us complete conviction in the Qur'an as the word of God. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik.